What if everything you thought you knew about royal bloodlines was wrong? What if the most famous spare in modern history wasn't a spare at all, but something the monarchy never planned for? And what if a rumor whispered for decades suddenly collided with modern science in a way the palace could no longer control? Because tonight's story doesn't begin with DNA tests or legal decrees. It begins with silence. Long, deliberate silence. For years, no decades. There has been one rumor the royal family never fully crushed. They ignored it. They dismissed it. They hoped it would fade. And yet, like a ghost that refuses to leave the room, it kept resurfacing. In tabloids, in late-night jokes, in awkward interviews, in knowing glances no one wanted to explain. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You already know the rumor. Most people do. But here's the question no one ever asks out loud. What happens if a rumor lives long enough to demand proof? Because this isn't just about gossip. This is about identity. This is about legitimacy. This is about a centuries-old institution built on one fragile assumption: blood. And blood, as history keeps reminding us, has a way of complicating everything. Picture this: a monarchy struggling to stay relevant in a modern world. A family fractured by interviews, books, betrayals, and distance. A public that no longer accepts "because we said so" as an answer. Now add one more ingredient. Science. Cold, precise, unemotional science. DNA doesn't care about tradition. It doesn't care about crowns. It doesn't care about optics or protocol or carefully worded palace statements. DNA only cares about truth. And if truth knocks on the palace door, what choice does the monarchy really have? Ask yourself this. If tomorrow, undeniable proof emerged that rewrote royal lineage, would titles still matter? Would loyalty survive? Would the crown bend or break? This is why this story matters now. Not because of scandal, not because of tabloid shock value, but because we live in an era where secrets don't stay buried forever, where history is constantly being re-examined, where institutions once considered untouchable are now questioned, audited, and challenged by a generation that wants receipts, not reassurances. For years, the public was told to stop speculating, to respect privacy, to move on, and many did. But rumors don't disappear just because we ask them to. They linger. They evolve. They wait for the right moment to resurface, sharper, louder, and harder to ignore. Especially when the people involved start pulling away from the institution meant to protect them. Especially when family tensions spill into public view. Especially when questions of belonging, identity, and rejection are already in the air. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When someone grows up being told they're different, eventually, they start wondering why. What does it do to a person to always feel slightly out of place in their own family? What does it do to be loved, yet questioned, protected, yet scrutinized? And what happens when that person starts asking questions the institution can't answer without opening doors it has kept locked for generations? This story isn't about proving anything. It's about imagining the consequences if something were proven. Because consequences are where the real drama lives. Titles aren't just honors. They're contracts, symbols, promises made between the crown and the public. And if the foundation of those promises is shaken, even hypothetically, the shockwaves travel far beyond one individual. They ripple through history, through law, through perception. They force impossible questions. Is a man defined by biology or by the life he lived? Is legitimacy inherited or earned? And if an institution survives on belief, what happens when belief fractures? Tonight, we're not chasing scandal. We're exploring a scenario so disruptive that even imagining it makes people uncomfortable. A scenario where whispered speculation collides with modern proof, where loyalty clashes with truth, where silence is no longer an option. And somewhere at the center of it all stands a man who has spent his entire life under a microscope. Now facing the most personal question of all: who am I really? Because if this hypothetical chain reaction ever began, if one confirmation set everything else in motion, the fallout wouldn't be immediate. It would be quiet at first. Closed doors. Emergency meetings, phone calls made in hushed voices. The public wouldn't hear a thing. Not yet. But behind palace walls, history would already be shifting. And the first sign wouldn't be an announcement. It would be hesitation. A pause where certainty used to be. A moment when someone realizes that the story they've protected for decades might no longer belong to them. But that moment, the one where everything truly begins, didn't start with a lab result. It started with a decision. A decision by someone who had stayed silent for years. To stop staying silent. And once that choice was made, there was no turning back. Because what came next didn't just threaten one title. It threatened the story the monarchy tells about itself. But that's where our story really begins. But here's the part that makes people shift in their seats. Because when someone breaks decades of silence, it's never just about truth. It's about timing. Why now? Why after years of denial, deflection, and carefully maintained distance? That question alone changes everything. Because silence isn't passive. Silence is strategic. And when silence ends, it's usually because someone believes the cost of speaking has finally become lower than the cost of staying quiet. Think about that. What would have to happen for a person to decide that shaking one of the world's most famous institutions is worth the consequences? Pressure builds slowly, privately, invisibly, until one day it doesn't. And in this hypothetical story, that pressure didn't explode in public. It cracked quietly behind closed doors. A private realization. A private reckoning. A private question that refused to stay private. What if this isn't just a rumor anymore? That's the moment everything changes. Because once doubt enters a system built on certainty, it doesn't politely wait to be addressed. It spreads. It infects conversations. It alters tone. It makes people hesitate where they used to speak with confidence. Suddenly, phrases like, "we've always known," turn into "we assume." And "it's settled" becomes "it's complicated." And here's the contradiction no one likes to admit. The monarchy survives not because it's perfect, but because people believe it is stable. Belief is the glue. Take that away, even hypothetically, and the entire structure begins to feel lighter. Fragile. Questionable. Now imagine being the person at the center of that doubt. Imagine growing up under relentless scrutiny. Your appearance analyzed. Your personality compared. Your every misstep magnified. Imagine being told you belong, while constantly being treated like you don't quite fit. And then imagine discovering that the question you've avoided your entire life might actually deserve an answer. Would you want to know? Be honest. If you were in that position, would you really choose ignorance over truth? Because truth, even when painful, offers clarity. And clarity can be addictive. That's the danger. Once someone starts asking questions, they don't stop at the convenient ones. They ask the ones that unravel everything. And if that hypothetical questioning ever reached the point of proof, the institution wouldn't just be dealing with a personal revelation. It would be dealing with precedent. Because this wouldn't be about one man. It would be about what happens when modern tools collide with ancient systems. When science meets symbolism. When DNA meets destiny. For centuries, lineage was a matter of record, witnesses, and trust. Now it's a matter of data, numbers, markers, certainty measured in probabilities. And that shift terrifies institutions built on tradition. Because tradition thrives on continuity. Science thrives on verification. Those two don't always get along. And that's why this hypothetical scenario is so explosive. Not because of scandal, but because it forces a question the monarchy never wants to answer publicly. What matters more? The story we've told, or the truth we can prove? That's not just a royal question. That's a human one. We all build identities on stories. Family stories, cultural stories, personal narratives we repeat until they feel solid. But what happens when evidence challenges the story you've lived by? Do you reject it? Do you fight it? Or do you let it change you? Now imagine that struggle happening on a global stage. Imagine knowing that whatever you choose will be dissected, politicized, monetized, and debated by millions of strangers. No privacy, no rehearsal, no undo button, just consequences. This is why the hypothetical fallout wouldn't be loud at first. It would be careful, measured. People would speak in hypotheticals, use phrases like "if true" and purely speculative. Because institutions don't panic publicly. They plan. And planning often involves delay. Delay buys time. Time buys options. But time also gives rumors room to grow. And in this story, the longer the silence lasts, the louder the speculation becomes. Because the public has changed. People don't wait patiently anymore. They investigate. They connect dots. They fill gaps. And gaps are dangerous. especially when they involve identity, legitimacy, and power. So let me ask you something. If proof existed, real proof, do you think it would ever stay secret? In a world of leaks, hacks, and whistleblowers, in a world where attention is currency and exclusives are priceless, history suggests otherwise. Secrets this big don't disappear. They migrate. From private conversations to quiet warnings. From quiet warnings to strategic leaks. From strategic leaks to headlines that no one can take back. And once the first headline drops, there's no clarifying later. The damage is already done. Reputations don't fracture all at once. They crack, slowly, audibly, until one final moment makes everyone realize the sound they've been hearing wasn't background noise. It was the structure giving way. That's what makes this scenario so unsettling. Because it's not dramatic in the way movies are dramatic. It's procedural, incremental, inevitable, and that's far scarier. There are no villains twirling mustaches here. No easy heroes. Just people trapped between loyalty and truth. Between love and obligation. Between what feels right and what looks right. And somewhere in the middle stands a man who didn't ask to be born into symbolism. A man who didn't choose to become a question mark. A man whose entire life has been shaped by assumptions he never consented to. So when whispers turn into possibilities, and possibilities threaten to become proof, the question stops being, is this true? And becomes something far more dangerous. What do we do if it is? That's where our story is headed. But before any tests, before any confirmations, before any consequences, there was one moment, one decision, one quiet shift that insiders later described as the beginning of the end. A meeting that wasn't supposed to happen. A conversation that wasn't supposed to be had. A question that wasn't supposed to be asked. And once it was asked, nothing could ever return to the way it was before. Because the next step wasn't speculation. It was action. And that action would force everyone involved to confront something the monarchy fears more than scandal. Certainty. But what happened inside those walls, and who pushed the first domino, is where this story truly turns. And that's exactly where we're going next. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people won't admit. Rumors don't survive for decades unless they're being fed. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes unintentionally. Sometimes by the very silence meant to kill them. And this rumor didn't just survive. It adapted. It changed shape depending on the decade, the headlines, the mood of the public. It slipped from tabloid joke to whispered question. From whispered question to awkward pause. From awkward pause to something people pretended not to hear, while hearing it anyway. That's how these things work. They don't announce themselves. They linger. Ask yourself something. How many rumors can you think of that have followed one public figure from childhood into middle age without ever fully disappearing? Very few. Because most rumors collapse under scrutiny, or boredom, or facts. This one didn't. And that alone should make you uneasy. Because the rumor wasn't loud at first. It didn't arrive screaming for attention. It crept in sideways, carried by comparison, coincidence, and suggestion. A look here, a resemblance there. A timing question no one wanted to spell out. And every time the palace refused to dignify it with a response, the silence became part of the story. Because silence isn't neutral. Silence invites interpretation. At first, it was treated like a punchline. Something late-night hosts could toss out with a grin. Something tabloids could splash across covers with dramatic fonts and winking headlines. But humor has a shelf life. Eventually, people stop laughing and start asking why the joke never goes away. And when they do, the tone changes. What was once absurd becomes uncomfortable. What was once dismissed becomes debated. What was once ignored becomes persistent. The rumor didn't spread because people wanted it to be true. It spread because no one could completely disprove it. And in the absence of clarity, imagination takes over. Here's where things get complicated. Royal families aren't like ordinary families. Their personal lives are political. Their relationships are symbolic. Their children aren't just children, they're continuity plans. Every birth is history in motion, which means every question about lineage isn't personal. It's institutional. And that's why this rumor was always dangerous. Not because of scandal, but because of implication. Because if lineage is questioned, legitimacy follows. And if legitimacy is questioned, everything else suddenly feels negotiable. Titles, succession, trust. So instead of confronting it head-on, The strategy was simple. Outgrow it. Let time do the work. Children grow. Faces change. The public moves on. New scandals arrive. New crises dominate headlines. And for a while, that strategy worked. The rumor faded into background noise. But here's what no one anticipated. The more distance there was between the origin of the rumor and the present day, the stranger it became that it still existed. Think about that. If something truly has no basis, time usually erases it. But this one aged like a question that never found an answer. And every major life moment seemed to revive it. A new photo, a new interview, a new comparison. Each time, the palace stayed quiet. Each time, the public filled the silence. And then something else happened. The tone shifted. What used to be said with a smirk started being said with a pause. People stopped asking, "Isn't that ridiculous?" and started asking, "Isn't it strange?" Strange timing. Strange resemblance. Strange how it's never fully addressed. Strange doesn't mean true. But strange is sticky. Strange gets under your skin. And here's the contradiction that made this rumor impossible to kill. The monarchy is built on mystique. But mystique and modern scrutiny don't coexist easily. In the past, you didn't question royal lineage because you couldn't. Records were controlled. Narratives were centralized. Information moved slowly. Now, everyone has a platform. Everyone has a theory. Everyone has a megaphone. And theories don't need proof to spread. They just need plausibility. That's what made this rumor resilient. Not evidence. Plausibility. A coincidence here. A comparison there. Enough ambiguity to keep it alive. And the more it was dismissed as offensive or inappropriate to discuss, the more it transformed into forbidden knowledge. You know how that works. Tell people not to think about something, and they think about it harder. So the rumor survived in the margins. In comment sections. In forums. In private conversations that ended with, "I know it's probably nothing, but..." That phrase did a lot of damage. Because probably nothing is still something. And while the public speculated, something else was happening quietly in the background. Distance. Physical distance. Emotional distance. Institutional distance. As relationships within the family strained and fractured, the rumor gained new oxygen. Because when unity breaks down, questions rush in to fill the gaps. People started re-examining everything. Past interviews. Old photographs. Body language. Moments that once seemed harmless. Was that joke deflection? Was that silence protection? Was that anger personal or institutional? The story started rewriting itself retroactively. And once that happens, you can't control where it goes. Now, here's the part that makes institutions nervous. Rumors don't need confirmation to cause damage. They only need repetition. And repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity breeds acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean belief, it means tolerance. And tolerance is dangerous, because once a rumor becomes tolerated, it becomes discussable. Once it's discussable, it becomes investigable. And once it's investigable, it's no longer just a rumor. That's the slippery slope. That's why some stories are buried aggressively, while others are left to fade. This one was left to fade. And it didn't. Instead, it waited. It waited through weddings, through funerals, through jubilees and scandals and public reconciliations that never quite held. It waited through an era where the monarchy tried to modernize without destabilizing itself. And then, suddenly, the context changed. People weren't just curious anymore. They were skeptical. And skepticism is a different beast. Skepticism asks for proof. Skepticism doesn't respect tradition. Skepticism doesn't care how uncomfortable the answer might be. It just wants clarity. And clarity is the one thing this rumor was never given. Which brings us to the moment everything shifted. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly. A journalist asking the wrong question. A source making an offhand comment. A conversation that wasn't meant to leave the room. And suddenly, what had always been dismissed as distasteful speculation began to feel unresolved. That's when the rumor stopped being funny. That's when it stopped being annoying. That's when it started feeling dangerous. Because once a rumor survives long enough, people stop asking if it's true and start asking why it hasn't been disproven. That subtle shift in framing changes everything. And behind palace walls, that shift was noticed. Advisors pay attention to tone. They track language. They monitor sentiment. And what they saw wasn't hysteria. It was persistence. A question that refused to die. A narrative that wouldn't collapse under time. And narratives like that force choices. Ignore it forever and let it metastasize. Or confront it and risk opening doors you may never be able to close again. That's the bind. That's the trap. And in this hypothetical story, this was a childhood shaped by symbolism. Every smile meant something. Every gesture was interpreted. Every misstep was archived. And the strangest part? None of it belonged to him. Before he knew who he was, the world had already decided who he was supposed to be. The spare, the backup, the contingency plan. Those labels sound harmless when spoken casually, almost playful. But imagine growing up knowing your role exists not because of who you are, but because of what you represent. That knowledge sinks in early, even if no one ever says it out loud. Especially if no one ever says it out loud. Children are perceptive. They notice patterns long before they understand explanations. They feel shifts in tone. They sense when attention changes. They recognize when expectations differ, even if adults insist everything is equal. And in this hypothetical story, the differences weren't dramatic. They were subtle. A different level of scrutiny. A different tolerance for mistakes. A different way of being spoken to or spoken about. The heir is prepared. The spare is managed. That distinction follows you everywhere. At school, at home, in public, in private moments when you're supposed to feel safe. And safety is a strange thing when you grow up under constant observation. Because privacy isn't something you lose suddenly. It's something you never fully have. Imagine learning to regulate your emotions not because it's healthy, but because cameras might be watching. Imagine being praised not just for kindness or curiosity, but for composure. Don't cry. Don't react. Don't embarrass the institution. That message doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. And over time, it shapes how a child sees himself. Not as a person, but as a role. Now layer something else on top of that. Comparison. Comparison is poison in any family. In this one, it was unavoidable. Two brothers. Two paths. One destiny already chosen. Every achievement measured. Every flaw contrasted. Every difference magnified. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because when people compare siblings relentlessly, the one who doesn't fit the mold starts asking questions. Why am I different? Why am I treated differently? Why do expectations feel heavier or lighter in ways I can't quite name? Those questions don't go away just because you're told everything is fine. They grow. And when you grow up hearing whispers, even if you don't fully understand them, they leave a residue. Children absorb tone before content. They know when adults go quiet. They know when conversations stop abruptly. They know when jokes are followed by uncomfortable laughter. And in this story, there were moments like that. Moments where laughter lingered a beat too long. Moments where comments were brushed off too quickly. Moments where reassurance felt rehearsed. Nothing overt. Nothing obvious. Just enough to create a background hum of unease. Now ask yourself something. If a child grows up sensing that parts of his identity are being carefully avoided, what does that do to his sense of belonging? Belonging isn't just about being included. It's about being unquestioned. And when belonging feels conditional, even love can feel complicated. Especially when that love exists inside an institution that values optics as much as affection. Because here's the contradiction. Royal families sell warmth, but they run on structure. And structure doesn't always leave room for emotional nuance. So children adapt. They become performers, or rebels, or both. They test boundaries. They seek attention in ways that feel risky because at least it's honest. Better to be criticized loudly than ignored quietly. Better to be known for something, anything, than to feel invisible inside a spotlight. And this hypothetical child learned early that attention followed behavior. Not always good behavior. Just behavior that broke the script. That realization changes you. It teaches you that identity can be shaped through disruption. If you can't define yourself positively, you'll define yourself defiantly. And defiance becomes a language. A way of saying, see me. But defiance inside a rigid system doesn't get interpreted as curiosity or pain. It gets labeled troublemaker, wild card, problem. Those labels stick too. And once they do, everything you do is filtered through them. Mistakes become patterns. Emotions become weaknesses. Questions become threats. And here's the cruel irony. The more a child struggles to fit in, the more the system tightens around him. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. Fear of embarrassment. Fear of instability. Fear of what questions might uncover. So the walls get higher, and the distance grows, which only reinforces the child's sense that something about him doesn't belong. And that's where the internal conflict begins. Because on the surface, life looks enviable. Privilege, access, opportunity. From the outside, people see gratitude as mandatory. How could you complain? Look at everything you have. But gratitude doesn't erase confusion, and it doesn't answer questions about who you really are. So those questions go underground. They become private. And private questions are the most dangerous kind, because they don't have an audience to soften them. They echo, and echo, and echo. Now imagine carrying those questions into adulthood. Imagine them resurfacing during moments of stress, moments of rejection, moments when loyalty feels one-sided. Because when you already feel different, exclusion hits harder, criticism cuts deeper, and narratives about your place in the family start feeling less like commentary and more like confirmation. Confirmation that maybe the unease you felt as a child wasn't imagined. Maybe it had a source. And once that thought appears, once, quietly, in the back of your mind, it changes how you interpret everything that follows. Every disagreement feels loaded. Every dismissal feels symbolic. Every distance feels intentional. And that's when identity stops being abstract. It becomes urgent. Because identity isn't just about where you come from. It's about where you're allowed to stand. And if you feel like your place is conditional, you eventually want to know why. That's human. So the child born into the spotlight grows up. The cameras never leave. The expectations shift, but they don't disappear. And the questions that once felt inappropriate start feeling necessary. Because adulthood brings autonomy. And autonomy brings choice. The choice to ask. The choice to confront. The choice to seek answers that were previously forbidden. And in this story, that choice didn't come from curiosity alone. It came from accumulation. Years of being told who you are. Years of being framed as secondary. Years of being described instead of understood. Eventually, the question stops being, why am I different? And becomes, what if there's a reason? That's the moment institutions fear most. Not rebellion. Not interviews. Not headlines. But self-inquiry. Because once a person starts questioning the story they've been given, they don't stop at the comfortable parts. They go all the way back. To origins. To timing. To truths that were never meant to be revisited. And when that happens inside a family built on lineage, the consequences aren't just personal. They're existential. Because if identity becomes unstable, legitimacy follows. And legitimacy is the cornerstone of everything. So while the world saw a prince growing up in public, behind the scenes, a man was forming. A man carrying questions no one had prepared him to ask. Questions that didn't accuse. Questions that didn't demand. Just questions that refused to disappear. And sooner or later, questions like that don't stay private. They find their way into conversations they were never meant to enter. Conversations behind closed doors. Conversations with people who know more than they say. Conversations that begin with, this might sound crazy, but... And once those conversations begin, they don't end with reassurance. They end with possibilities. Possibilities that threaten to reopen a story everyone thought time had buried. And the next chapter of this story isn't about rumors anymore. It's about the moment those questions intersected with a name that had always hovered at the edge of the speculation. A name that made people uncomfortable. A name tied to a past the institution never wanted revisited. Because once that name entered the conversation again, the rumor stopped being abstract. It became personal. Why do some names refuse to stay in the past? You know the kind I mean. Names that resurface not because anyone wants them to, but because they were never fully resolved. Not shouted, not announced, just quietly re-entering the conversation like it never really left. Because when a rumor circles around lineage, it always looks for an anchor. Something tangible, someone human, a face the imagination can attach itself to. And in this story, that anchor had always existed, hovering at the edge of the narrative. Mentioned, dismissed, mocked, then forgotten. Only to return again. The man at the center of the whispers. Not a villain, not a hero, just a person whose name became entangled in a story bigger than any individual could control. And that's what makes this part uncomfortable. Because once a human being becomes symbolic, nuance disappears. Context fades. Complexity collapses. All that remains is association. And association is powerful. In this hypothetical narrative, his name didn't surface loudly. It surfaced cautiously, as a question, a reminder, a possibility people pretended not to consider, while considering it anyway. Why does that name keep coming up? That's the question insiders allegedly began asking again. Not because they believed anything had changed, but because something felt unfinished. The past, it turns out, doesn't stay buried just because it's inconvenient. It waits. And when it returns, it doesn't knock. It slips in through side doors, through old timelines being re-examined, through dates being quietly double-checked, through conversations that start with, "This probably means nothing, but..." That phrase again, "probably nothing." Those are dangerous words, because probably nothing is often how people approach things they're afraid to examine too closely. So let's talk about why this name carried so much weight in the first place. Not because of proof, not because of certainty, but because of proximity. Proximity to a moment in time that was already emotionally charged. Proximity to a narrative that history never fully settled. Proximity to a chapter the institution prefers to remember selectively. And here's where people get uncomfortable. Because discussing proximity feels invasive. It feels speculative. It feels unfair. And in many ways, it is. But fairness doesn't determine whether stories spread. Plausibility does. And in this case, plausibility lived in the margins, in timelines, in public appearances, in moments that were heavily documented, but never contextualized. The irony? The more transparent history becomes, the more material there is to reinterpret. Old photographs don't change, but the way people look at them does. Old interviews don't disappear, but the questions people ask about them evolve. And suddenly, things that once felt settled start feeling open. That's when the name re-enters the conversation, not as an accusation, as a variable. A reminder that history isn't always as neat as official narratives suggest. And here's the part people often overlook. The man at the center of the whispers didn't ask for the role. He didn't audition for it. He didn't benefit from it. In fact, association with a rumor like this isn't empowering. It's isolating. It turns a person into a symbol they can't escape. Every word they've ever spoken gets reinterpreted. Every silence gets analyzed. Every denial gets weighed for tone rather than content. And silence becomes especially dangerous. Because silence can mean dignity, but it can also be framed as avoidance. And once that framing sticks, intent stops matching. Now imagine being that person, living a life long after the moment everyone fixates on, trying to exist outside a story that refuses to let you go. And every few years, the whispers return, not because of anything you've done, but because someone else's identity remains unresolved. That's a heavy burden. And in this hypothetical story, the weight of that burden had grown heavier with time. Because this wasn't just about gossip anymore. It was about closure. People wanted an ending. They wanted a definitive answer. And narratives without endings make people restless. So when internal questions began circulating, quietly, cautiously, this name resurfaced not as a target, but as a reference point, a loose thread. And loose threads make institutions nervous. Because once you pull one, you don't know what else might unravel. Here's another contradiction. Institutions crave stability, but history is messy. And when history is messy, stability depends on selective memory. You remember what reinforces continuity. You minimize what complicates it. For a long time, that strategy worked. The past was the past, until the present began asking different questions. Questions shaped by modern expectations. Transparency, accountability, evidence. The kind of expectations that don't care how uncomfortable the answers might be. And in that environment, the old strategy of ignoring uncomfortable names starts to feel outdated. Risky, because ignoring something today doesn't make it disappear. It makes it look suspicious. So in this story, the name wasn't resurrected by tabloids first. It was resurrected internally, as part of a thought exercise, a worst-case scenario. A hypothetical discussion no one wanted to have, but felt irresponsible not to. What if the rumor escalates? What if someone pushes for proof? What if the questions stop being rhetorical? Those questions don't accuse anyone. They prepare for outcomes. And preparation often involves revisiting things you hoped time had erased. So suddenly, conversations that hadn't happened in years were happening again. Quietly, carefully, legally. And that's when the story took on a different tone. Because once legal minds enter a conversation, speculation shifts into risk assessment. What exposure exists? What narratives could resurface? What precedents could be triggered? And in that context, the name wasn't emotional. It was logistical, a variable in a larger equation. And that's chilling, because it reduces human lives to probabilities. It strips away feelings and focuses on outcomes, which tells you just how serious the situation had become. Now let me ask you something. If you were part of an institution built on lineage, and one unresolved question threatened that foundation, wouldn't you at least want to know the answer? Not for drama, for control. Because uncertainty is harder to manage than bad news. Bad news can be framed. It can be contained. It can be addressed. Uncertainty lingers. It leaks. It grows. And the man at the center of the whispers represented uncertainty, not because of what he claimed, but because of what people projected onto him. And projections are powerful. They don't require cooperation. They don't require consent. They only require imagination. And imagination is endless. So while the public saw nothing but silence, behind the scenes, something had shifted. The name was no longer taboo. It was on the table, not spoken loudly, not written down casually, but acknowledged as something that could no longer be ignored if the institution wanted to stay ahead of the story rather than chase it. And that acknowledgement changed the stakes. Because once a possibility is acknowledged internally, it becomes actionable. Not inevitable, but actionable. And action introduces consequences for everyone involved. The man whose name had become symbolic, the individual questioning his identity, the institution weighing tradition against certainty. Everyone stood to lose something. Reputation, stability, illusion. And illusions, once cracked, never fully return. That's why this chapter matters. Not because of what anyone did, but because of what people began considering. The moment speculation moves from the public sphere into private strategy rooms, it stops being noise. It becomes a problem to solve. And solving it means choosing between two equally dangerous paths. Do nothing, and let the story grow on its own terms. Or seek answers, and risk uncovering something you can't unlearn. In this story, that choice hovered in the air. Unspoken, unresolved. And the man at the center of the whispers became more than a name. He became a crossroads. Because the next step wouldn't involve rumors. It wouldn't involve history. It wouldn't involve interpretation. It would involve science. And science doesn't care how carefully a story has been constructed. It only cares whether it holds up under scrutiny. What happens when truth stops being philosophical and becomes measurable? That's the moment every institution built on tradition dreads. Because tradition can argue. Tradition can deflect. Tradition can reinterpret itself just enough to survive another generation. Science doesn't negotiate. Science doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care what you represent. It doesn't care how many centuries your story has been told the same way. Science only asks one question. Does the data support the claim? And once that question enters the room, everything else goes quiet. In this hypothetical scenario, the idea of science entering the palace didn't happen dramatically. There were no white lab coats walking past gilded halls. No dramatic declarations. No obvious signs. It began the way uncomfortable truths usually do. As a contingency. A whispered what if. A line in a memo that wasn't meant to stand out. What if this escalates? What if the questions don't stop? What if someone, somewhere, decides to force the issue? Because here's the thing about modern life. You don't always get to choose when science becomes involved. Sometimes, science gets invited. Sometimes, it gets demanded. And sometimes, it arrives simply because it can. DNA testing isn't rare. It isn't exotic. It isn't even particularly expensive. It's routine, which is exactly what makes it terrifying. In the past, lineage depended on witnesses, documentation, and trust. All of those could be managed, controlled, curated. DNA can't. Once a sample exists, the answer exists. And answers have a way of slipping out. So the conversation shifted. Not publicly. Internally. From, is this rumor harmful? To what if someone tries to prove it? That's a completely different problem. Because harm can be mitigated. Proof has to be confronted. Now imagine being in a room where that realization lands. A room full of people whose job is to protect continuity, to manage risk, to anticipate fallout. And suddenly, the greatest risk isn't scandal. It's certainty. Because certainty removes options. Once something is known, It can't be unknown. You can't negotiate with data. You can't spin probabilities that reach statistical confidence. You can't dismiss evidence just because it's inconvenient. So the mere idea of science entering the equation caused something close to panic. Not emotional panic, but procedural panic. Checklists, scenarios, legal frameworks. What would this mean? Who would be affected? What could be challenged? Because this wouldn't. That's a subtle but massive shift. Because survival planning assumes impact. And impact planning means acknowledging vulnerability. Institutions hate doing that. But pretending invulnerability in a transparent world is worse. It looks dishonest. And dishonesty erodes trust faster than bad news. So behind closed doors, discussions took on a new gravity. Legal advisors spoke carefully. Medical experts spoke clinically. Strategists spoke in probabilities. And probabilities are cold comfort when the stakes involve identity and legacy. Because even a small probability feels enormous when the outcome is irreversible. Now let me ask you something. If you were in that position, if you knew a test could clarify everything or destroy everything, would you want it done? Would you choose certainty over stability? Would you risk the truth if it meant losing control of the story? Or would you protect the story at all costs, even if it meant living with doubt? There's no easy answer. And that's why this scenario is so powerful. Because it forces a choice no one wants to make. In this hypothetical narrative, the idea of science didn't enter as an action. It entered as a shadow, a looming possibility, a reminder that the tools to resolve the question already existed, and that someone, somewhere, could use them without permission. That's the part people underestimate. You don't always get to decide how truth enters the world. Sometimes it arrives uninvited. Sometimes it arrives through people who feel excluded, ignored, or dismissed. Sometimes it arrives because someone believes the truth matters more than tradition. And once that belief takes hold, containment becomes impossible. Because science democratizes truth. It takes power away from gatekeepers. It puts answers into the hands of anyone willing to ask the question. And that terrifies institutions built on managed narratives. So the palace, in this story, faced a narrowing corridor of options. Do nothing, and risk someone else doing something first. Or take control, and risk uncovering something you can't control afterward. Neither option is safe. That's the paradox. And while the public remained unaware, the tension inside those walls intensified. Every new headline felt like a threat. Every offhand comment felt like a warning. The question wasn't if science would enter the conversation. It was when, and who would open the door. Because once that door opened, there would be no pretending this was just rumor anymore. It would become a matter of record, a matter of data, a matter of truth. And truth, once introduced, demands consequences. Consequences that don't always align with tradition. Consequences that don't always feel fair. Consequences that don't care about timing. So when science finally did enter the palace in this hypothetical scenario, it didn't do so loudly. It did so with inevitability. Quiet, clinical, unstoppable. And the people who realized that first understood something chilling. The question they had been avoiding wasn't whether the truth could be proven. It was whether anyone was ready to live with the answer. Because the moment science crosses from possibility into action, everything changes. But what triggered that shift? What turned science from a shadow into a step wasn't a public demand or a media expose. It was a private decision. A decision made by someone who felt the cost of not knowing had become greater than the cost of knowing. And that decision would pull everyone else into a story they could no longer control. What happens when the walls that protect an institution start separating the people inside it? That's the moment unity turns into strategy. And strategy, unlike loyalty, has sides. The hypothetical decision to even consider science didn't land softly. It landed like a fracture. Not loud, not explosive, but unmistakable to those who felt it. Because once the possibility of answers became real, alignment vanished. There was no single reaction, no unified response, no shared instinct. Instead, there were camps, quietly forming, carefully positioning themselves, not because anyone wanted conflict, but because everyone feared different outcomes. And fear has a way of reorganizing priorities. On one side were the traditionalists, the guardians of continuity, the people who believed that stability mattered more than certainty. To them, the institution wasn't just a family. It was a symbol Symbols don't survive by interrogating themselves endlessly. They survive by projecting confidence. In their view, even entertaining the idea of scientific confirmation was a mistake, not because they believed the rumor, but because they believed in containment. Why open a door you can keep closed? Why invite questions you can dismiss? Why validate speculation by treating it seriously? Their argument was simple. This story has existed for decades, and the institution survived it. Why change strategy now? Why risk destabilizing everything for a question that, in their view, didn't deserve oxygen? Because oxygen feeds fire. That was their fear. On the other side were the realists. The ones who watched public sentiment closely. The ones who understood how narratives evolve in the digital age. They weren't convinced silence was still working. They saw something else. Fatigue. Public fatigue with deflection. Fatigue with vague reassurances. Fatigue with the sense that uncomfortable questions were being deliberately avoided. In their view, ignoring the issue wasn't neutral anymore. It was suspicious. And suspicion, once it takes hold, doesn't need proof to cause damage. They argued that uncertainty was the real threat, that a question left unanswered becomes a magnet for increasingly extreme theories, that control isn't maintained by avoidance, it's maintained by decisiveness, even when decisiveness is painful. And then there were the pragmatists, not driven by ideology or image, driven by liability. They didn't care about optics. They didn't care about tradition. They cared about exposure, legal exposure, reputational exposure, historical exposure. Their concern wasn't whether the truth would hurt. It was whether the institution could survive being seen as evasive if the truth came out through other channels. Because if someone else revealed answers first, without preparation, without framing, the damage would be far worse. This wasn't about dignity. It was about control of the narrative. So the palace, in this hypothetical moment, became something it rarely admits to being. Divided. Not publicly, not overtly, but philosophically. Different priorities, different fears, different definitions of what survival looked like. And when institutions divide internally, decision-making slows. Every move gets debated. Every option gets questioned. Every silence becomes heavier. Because no one wants to be the person responsible for opening Pandora's box. But no one wants to be blamed for letting it open itself. That's the bind. So meetings multiplied. Private briefings. Confidential assessments. Scenarios mapped out in language so careful it bordered on evasive. Worst-case outcomes were discussed without being named. Potential fallout was acknowledged without being detailed. Everyone understood the stakes. No one wanted to say them out loud, because saying them made them feel real. And here's where the emotional dimension complicates everything. This wasn't just a policy issue. This was family. And family dynamics don't respond well to strategic planning. People bring history into rooms whether they're invited or not. Old grievances, unspoken loyalties, personal attachments. Some advisors had known the family for decades. Some felt protective. Some felt resentful. And those emotions leaked into judgment. It's impossible to separate personal loyalty from institutional responsibility when the two have been intertwined for generations. That's the paradox of dynasties. They function as families until they don't. And this was one of those moments. Some voices argued for compassion. What does this do to the individual at the center of it all? What does prolonged uncertainty do to a person already under scrutiny? They believed clarity, even painful clarity, could be a form of mercy. Others disagreed. They worried that clarity would only deepen wounds, that answers wouldn't heal anything. They would just rearrange blame. And blame is radioactive. Once it appears, it contaminates everything it touches. So the question wasn't just whether to seek answers. It was whether answers would actually resolve anything, or whether they would simply create new fractures. Now add one more layer. Timing. The institution wasn't operating in a vacuum. There were already tensions, already controversies, already public debates about relevance and reform. Adding another destabilizing event felt reckless to some, strategic to others, because crisis can also reset narratives. Handled correctly, it can reframe an institution as transparent, accountable, and modern. Handled poorly, it can collapse trust entirely. And trust is the currency of legitimacy. So the palace wasn't just divided on action. It was divided on identity. What kind of institution did it want to be in the modern era? One that protects itself through silence? or one that survives through transparency. Those two paths lead to very different futures, and neither guarantees safety. The more these debates continued, the more one thing became clear. No option would satisfy everyone. Someone would feel betrayed. Someone would feel exposed. Someone would feel sacrificed for the greater good. That's the cost of institutional survival. Individuals become variables. And in this story, one individual already felt like a variable long before any of this began, which only deepened the unease. Because the palace wasn't just divided among advisors. It was divided within the family itself. Private conversations grew tense. Words were chosen carefully. Silences stretched longer than usual. Questions were deflected not with authority, but with exhaustion. And exhaustion is dangerous. Exhausted people make mistakes. They speak when they shouldn't. They withhold when they should explain. They choose short-term relief over long-term consequences. And this hypothetical scenario was fertile ground for mistakes. Because while internal debates dragged on, the outside world didn't pause. Speculation continued. Narratives evolved. Public sentiment shifted. Every day, without clarity, added another layer of interpretation. And interpretation has a way of hardening into belief. So the palace found itself in a narrowing window. Act too soon and risk unnecessary damage. Act too late and lose control entirely. That's when the division became more pronounced. Subtle alliances formed. People aligned not by rank, but by risk tolerance. Who was willing to gamble? Who wanted to preserve at all costs? Who believed the truth would ultimately strengthen the institution? Those beliefs mattered. Because belief influences advice, and advice influences decisions. And decisions, once made, ripple outward. Now imagine being the person at the center of this storm, aware that conversations are happening, aware that your identity is being debated in abstract terms, not present in the room, not represented in the discussions, just referenced. That kind of distance is brutal. It turns you into a subject rather than a participant, and subjects rarely feel respected, which only reinforces feelings of alienation. And alienation has consequences. People who feel alienated stop prioritizing harmony. They start prioritizing truth, or autonomy, or escape. And that's when things slip beyond institutional control. Because the palace can debate strategy endlessly, but it can't control individual choice. And in this story, individual choice was becoming increasingly relevant. Because someone was growing tired of waiting, tired of silence, tired of ambiguity, tired of being discussed instead of consulted. And while the palace argued about whether to open the door to science, someone else was considering whether to open it themselves. That's the part institutions never see coming. They assume control until they lose it. And the division inside the palace made that loss more likely. Because division slows response. It creates gaps. And gaps are where decisive individuals step in. So as the debates dragged on, something shifted. The center of gravity moved. The story stopped being solely about institutional strategy. It started becoming about personal agency. Because when institutions hesitate, individuals act. And the next phase of this story wouldn't be shaped by committees or advisors. It would be shaped by a choice made quietly, privately, and decisively. A choice that would bypass internal divisions entirely. A choice that would force the palace to react rather than plan. Because once that choice was made, there would be no more hypothetical scenarios, no more internal debates, no more strategic delays. There would only be consequences. And the first sign that this shift had already happened wouldn't be an announcement. It would be a sudden realization that something had been set in motion without consensus, and that the palace, divided and delayed, was no longer in control of the timeline. What happens to a bond when everything it rests on starts to feel uncertain? Because before this was about institutions, advisors, or strategy, it was about two people who grew up side by side. Two brothers. Same house. Same traditions. Same cameras. But never the same expectations. Brotherhood sounds romantic when spoken from a distance. It implies loyalty, protection, shared history. And for a long time, that image held, at least publicly. But relationships don't exist in headlines. They exist in moments no one sees. And those moments are where strain begins. At first, the strain wasn't dramatic. It never is. It was subtle. A pause before answering a question. A glance that didn't quite meet the other's eyes. A joke that landed flat instead of bonding. those things accumulate. And when they do, people start telling themselves stories to explain the discomfort. Maybe he's just stressed. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe this phase will pass. But phases don't last forever. They either resolve or harden. In this hypothetical story, the Brotherhood had already been under pressure long before rumors resurfaced with new intensity. Different roles create different realities. One brother prepared from birth for inevitability. The other raised with freedom, but also with ambiguity. Freedom sounds appealing until you realize it often comes with less clarity, less certainty about where you stand. And certainty matters more than people admit, especially in families where hierarchy is baked into identity. So even before science, before strategy, before internal debates, there was distance. Distance shaped by duty. Distance shaped by expectation. Distance shaped by the fact that one path was always defined and the other was always flexible. Flexible can feel like disposable, and disposable is a dangerous feeling, because when you feel replaceable, every slight feels symbolic. Every disagreement feels existential, and that's how misunderstandings escalate. Now imagine introducing an unresolved identity question into that dynamic. Not as an accusation, not as a demand, but as a presence. Something hovering, something unsaid. That kind of tension doesn't need to be voiced to be felt. Brothers feel shifts in each other instinctively. They notice when conversations become guarded. They notice when openness turns into formality. And formality between siblings is often the first sign that something has gone wrong. So when internal divisions began forming inside the palace, they didn't stay contained. They leaked into personal relationships. Because institutional pressure always finds its way home. One brother, positioned as continuity, felt the weight of responsibility increase. Protect the institution. Protect stability. Protect the story. The other, already feeling peripheral, felt something else. Exclusion. Not deliberate cruelty, but emotional absence. The sense that decisions were being made without him. About him. And that's when resentment begins to take shape. Resentment doesn't arrive screaming. It whispers. It says, they don't trust you. It says, they've already decided. It says, you're being managed, not respected. And once resentment finds a foothold, even neutral actions get reinterpreted. Silence becomes avoidance. Caution becomes judgment. Concern becomes control. So conversations between the brothers grew careful, less spontaneous, more measured. Words were chosen not for honesty, but for safety. And safety kills intimacy. Because intimacy requires risk. The risk of being misunderstood. The risk of being vulnerable. The risk of saying the wrong thing. But when the stakes feel too high, people stop taking risks. They retreat. And retreat creates space. Space fills with assumption. Now add one more complication. Comparison. The public had always compared them. But now the brothers were starting to feel that comparison internally. One seen as stability. The other as volatility. Those labels weren't fair. But they were convenient. And convenience often trumps accuracy in institutions. So when questions about identity began circulating more seriously, the Brotherhood felt the strain acutely. Because if identity is questioned, roles are questioned. And if roles are questioned, the balance shifts. That's unsettling for everyone involved. Especially for the brother whose role was built on certainty. Because imagine this. If something foundational changes, even hypothetically, what does that do to the relationship? Does it create guilt? Does it create defensiveness? Does it create distance? Often, it creates all three. So rather than addressing the tension directly, both brothers did what people under pressure often do. They avoided the subject. They talked around it. They changed topics. They focused on logistics. Anything but the thing that hovered between them. But avoidance doesn't dissolve tension. It concentrates it. Until one day, something small triggers a disproportionate reaction. A comment taken the wrong way. A decision that feels unilateral. A moment where one brother realizes the other has information he doesn't. That's when trust takes a hit. And trust, once damaged, doesn't bounce back easily. Because trust isn't built on love alone. It's built on transparency. And transparency was in short supply. Now imagine the internal palace debates happening in parallel. Meetings, briefings, contingency plans. And imagine one brother being closer to those conversations than the other. Not out of malice, out of position. But position doesn't soften exclusion. It amplifies it. Because exclusion feels intentional when you don't see the reasons behind it. So the brotherhood reached a quiet impasse. Neither wanted to escalate. Neither wanted to accuse. But both felt misunderstood. And misunderstanding is corrosive. It eats away at shared history. It reframes memories. Moments that once felt supportive start feeling conditional. And that's dangerous territory. Because when shared history becomes contested, relationships fracture. Now ask yourself this. If you felt your identity was being debated by people you didn't choose, wouldn't you expect your closest family to stand with you? And if you felt they weren't, even if that perception